The morning sun peeked through the wide windows of Sunnyside Diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Priya moved swiftly between tables, her well-worn sneakers squeaking against the tiles as she balanced 3 plates of steaming pancakes on one arm. She'd mastered this dance years ago. The weaving between chairs, the dodging of outstretched bags, the perfect timing of coffee refills. "Order up," called out Uncle Joe from the kitchen window, his voice mixing with the clatter of plates and morning chatter. Priya's fingers drummed a quick rhythm on the serving tray as she passed. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. A habit that had earned her curious glances from customers over the years. Little did they know each tap was a note, each rhythm a piece of music playing in her head. The morning rush brought its usual characters. The businessman who always loosened his tie before diving into his eggs Benedict, the elderly couple who shared a single portion of toast and endless stories, and the college students hunched over their laptops, nursing cups of coffee like precious lifelines. Priya knew all their orders by heart, just as her fingers knew Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. "You're humming again, dear," Mrs. Kumar smiled as Priya topped up her tea. The old woman had been coming to the diner every morning for the past 5 years, and she was one of the few who knew Priya's secret. "That's Chopin, isn't it? The Nocturne in E-flat major." Priya felt her cheeks warm as she nodded. She hadn't even realized she was humming. "My mom used to play it," she said softly, adjusting the notepad in her apron pocket. "Before we sold the piano." The weight of those words hung in the air, heavier than any tray she'd ever carried. 10 years of classical training, countless competitions, and dreams of concert halls. All packed away like the piano that once filled her family's tiny living room with music. Now, at 28, she served pancakes and coffee instead of performing concertos. Between orders, Priya's hands found their way to the counter's edge, her fingers pressing invisible keys. The morning light caught the small calluses on her fingertips, not from carrying plates, but from years of practice that refused to fade. Her body remembered every scale, every arpeggio, every piece she'd ever learned. "Hey, Dreamer." Uncle Joe's voice snapped her back to reality. "Table 7's getting antsy for their check." Priya quickly pulled out her notepad, but not before her fingers completed the phrase they were playing. Even now, she couldn't leave a musical sentence unfinished. She hurried to table 7, where a mother was trying to keep her young daughter entertained with crayons and a paper placemat. The little girl looked up as Priya approached. "What song were you playing?" she asked, pointing to the counter where Priya had been standing. "I wasn't," Priya started to say, but the girl's mother interrupted with a knowing smile. "She does that all the time, sweetie. Makes the whole place feel like a concert hall, doesn't it?" Priya felt something flutter in her chest, part pride, part longing. She'd thought she was being subtle with her counter concerts, but apparently her audience had grown without her knowing. As she printed their check, her fingers continued their silent performance, and for a moment, she could almost hear the music rising above the diner's buzz, as real as the coffee steam curling in the morning light. The breakfast rush would soon give way to the quiet lull before lunch, and Priya knew what she'd do with those precious minutes. The church across the street had become her sanctuary, its old upright piano her confession booth. But for now, she had orders to fill and tables to clear, each movement a dance between the life she lived and the one she still dreamed of living. The lunch rush had finally died down, and Priya checked her watch, 2:45 p.m. She untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it beneath the counter. "Taking my break, Uncle Joe," she called out, already halfway to the diner's glass door. The familiar bell chimed as she stepped out into the afternoon sun. The old stone church stood across the street, its weathered steps welcoming her like an old friend. She'd been sneaking in during her breaks for so long now that even the pigeons recognized her, scattering lazily as she approached. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and the cool air inside wrapped around her like a gentle hug. "Ah, right on time." Father Thomas's kind voice echoed from somewhere near the altar. The elderly priest appeared from behind a column, his silver hair catching the colored light from the stained glass windows. He never made her feel like an intruder, even though she wasn't part of his congregation. "The piano's been waiting for you," he said with a warm smile. Prida walked down the aisle, her steps quickening as she got closer to the old upright piano tucked away in the corner. It wasn't anything fancy. The wood was scratched in places, and some of the ivory keys had yellowed with age. But to her, it was more precious than any grand piano she'd ever played. She sat down on the worn bench, taking a moment to adjust its wobbly leg. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and she closed her eyes, letting out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Here, she wasn't just a waitress. Here, she could be herself. The first notes of Chopin filled the empty church. Priya started softly, almost hesitantly, like someone testing the temperature of a pool before diving in. But soon, the music took over. Her hands danced across the keys, bringing to life the pieces she'd kept locked away in her heart. The nocturne flowed from her fingers like water, each note telling the story of dreams put on hold and melodies waiting to be heard. Father Thomas sat in the back pew, eyes closed, listening as he did every day. He never interrupted, never asked why a waitress played like a concert pianist. He just listened, and somehow that made all the difference. Today, she played with extra feeling. The morning's interactions at the diner had stirred something in her. The little girl's curiosity, Mrs. Kumar's recognition of the piece, even the way her regular customers had grown used to her musical habits. As her fingers moved across the keys, she remembered the way her mother used to play this same nocturne, how their tiny apartment would fill with music every evening after dinner. A wrong note jolted her back to reality. Priya paused, frustrated with herself. "You're rushing," she muttered, starting the section again. This time, she took it slower, letting each note breathe. The piece had always been her mother's favorite, and playing it felt like having a conversation with her, even though they were now separated by more than just distance. The sound of shuffling feet made her look up. A small group of tourists had wandered in, drawn by the music. They stood near the entrance, phones forgotten in their hands as they listened. Priya felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't stop playing. Instead, she straightened her back slightly, just as her old piano teacher had taught her, and continued the piece. When the final notes faded away, the tourists broke into soft applause. Priya ducked her head, embarrassed by the attention. She wasn't used to people actually watching her play anymore. It had been so long since she performed for anyone except Father Thomas and the church's empty pews. "You should play for more people," one of the tourists said as they left, but Priya just smiled politely. If only they knew how many times she dreamed of doing exactly that. Her phone buzzed. Break time was almost over. She closed the piano lid gently, running her hand over the worn wood. "Thank you," she whispered, both to the piano and to Father Thomas, who pretended to be busy arranging hymn books. As she walked back to the diner, her steps fell into the rhythm of the piece she just played. The music stayed with her, humming in her bones, making the world feel a little brighter, a little more possible. For those precious minutes at the piano, she'd been more than just a waitress. She'd been the musician she always dreamed of becoming. Now it was time to go back to reality, back to serving coffee and clearing tables. But the music would stay with her, playing in her heart, waiting for tomorrow's break time when she could let it out again. Rain drummed against the diner's windows, turning the usual Tuesday afternoon into a cozy refuge for people escaping the weather. Priya moved between tables with fresh coffee, her shoes leaving wet marks on the floor from her last dash to serve customers in the outdoor section before the rain got too heavy. A young man sat in the corner booth, his laptop open and a half-eaten sandwich forgotten beside it. He was different from the usual customers. There was something about the way he sat, how his fingers moved when he typed, that reminded Priya of her old conservatory friends. Musicians had a way of moving their hands, even when they weren't playing. As she approached to clear his plate, her eyes caught something on his screen, a poster, vibrant against the white background. Local music competition, the headline read. Priya's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to act normal, to not look too closely. "Could I get some more coffee?" the man asked, closing his laptop halfway. But not before Priya glimpsed more details. Grand prize, full scholarship to City Conservatory, and debut recital opportunity. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured his coffee. "Are you a musician?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. He looked up, surprised. "Yeah, I teach at the community center. We're trying to spread the word about this competition." He reopened his laptop, turning it slightly toward her. "It's open to anyone over 18 who hasn't had formal training in the last 5 years. The conservatory is trying to find hidden talents, people who might have given up music because of life circumstances." Prida's throat felt tight. That described her exactly. The girl who'd given up her music dreams to help support her family, who played on an old church piano during lunch breaks because she couldn't bear to stop completely. "The deadline's in 2 weeks," he continued, scrolling through the details. "Winner gets a full ride at the conservatory, plus a debut performance. Second and third places get partial scholarships." Uncle Joe called from the kitchen, "Order up," but Priya felt rooted to the spot. The man must have noticed something in her expression because he added, "You play?" She nodded, then quickly shook her head. "I used to. It was a long time ago." "You should enter." He pulled out a flyer from his bag. "Here's all the information. The first round is recorded submissions. You just need to send a video of 2 contrasting pieces." Priya took the flyer with damp fingers, quickly tucking it into her apron pocket as more customers came in, shaking off umbrellas and asking for hot coffee. But throughout her shift, she felt the paper burning against her hip, like a secret trying to escape. During a quiet moment, she pulled out the flyer in the break room, smoothing its creased edges. The entry fee made her wince. It was exactly what she'd saved in tips this week, money that was supposed to help with her mother's medical bills. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her mother. "Don't forget to eat properly, Beta. Working too hard isn't good for you." Attached was a photo of her mother's smiling face, taken in the hospital garden where she did her daily physiotherapy walks. Priya touched the screen gently. Her mother had been the one who'd started her on piano, who'd worked extra hours to pay for lessons, who'd sat beside her during all those childhood practice sessions. And it was her mother's illness that had finally forced Priya to sell their piano and take this waitressing job. The break room door opened, and she quickly folded the flyer again. Uncle Joe poked his head in. "You okay, kid? You've been kind of spacey today." "I'm fine," she said automatically, but then paused. "Uncle Joe, do you think it's selfish to want something just for yourself?" He leaned against the doorframe, his usual gruff expression softening. "Depends. Is it something that makes you really happy?" The answer stuck in her throat. Yes, music made her happy. It was the only thing that made her feel completely alive. But was happiness enough of a reason to spend money they needed for more important things? The rain had stopped by the time her shift ended. Priya walked home slowly, the competition flyer now wrapped around her tip money in her pocket. At each crosswalk, she found herself playing fragments of pieces in her head. The Chopin she perfected years ago, the Beethoven sonata that had won her last competition before everything changed. Tomorrow was her day off. She could go to the church, record something on her phone. No, she told herself firmly. It was a silly dream. But as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, her fingers were already moving, practicing silently in the growing darkness, refusing to let go of the possibility that had walked into the diner on this rainy Tuesday afternoon. The evening shift had been particularly exhausting. Priya's feet ached as she counted her tips, arranging the bills in neat piles on the break room table. A small jar labeled "Mom's Medicine" sat beside her elbow, already half full with the week's earnings. She picked up another $5 bill, smoothing its crumpled edges before adding it to the pile. The competition flyer lay open next to the money, its deadline date circled in red. 5 days had passed since the man with the laptop had left it, and Priya hadn't been able to throw it away. She'd read it so many times that the paper had become soft at the creases, like a well-loved letter. Still here? Uncle Joe's voice made her jump. She hadn't heard him come in. You worked a double shift today. Should have gone home hours ago. Just finishing up, she said, quickly tucking the flyer under the tip jar. But he'd already seen it. That music thing's still on your mind. He pulled up a chair, the metal legs scraping against the floor. You know, I've been running this diner for 30 years. Seen all kinds of people come through those doors. Most of them just passing through, waiting for something better. Priya kept counting bills, trying to focus on the numbers instead of the weight in her chest. I'm not waiting for anything better, she said softly. This job helps my mom. That's what matters. Uncle Joe was quiet for a moment, watching her stack coins. Your mom called the diner today, while you were serving that big party in the corner. Asked if you were eating properly, taking breaks. He chuckled. She said you used to forget to eat when you were practicing piano, too caught up in the music to remember dinner. Priya's hands stilled. Her mother rarely called the diner. She was always careful not to disturb Priya at work. Is she okay? Sounded better than last time. Said her new medication is helping. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. She also said something interesting. Asked if you still play that old piano in the church across the street. Heat crept up Priya's neck. You knew about that. Kid, everyone knows. We can see the church from our front window. His voice was gentle. Your mom said she misses hearing you play. Said it was like having sunshine in the house. The coins clinked as Priya's hands began to shake. She'd been so careful not to mention the church piano to her mother, afraid it would remind her of the instrument they'd had to sell. I can't think about music right now, she whispered. The new treatment is expensive, and the insurance only covers part of it. Uncle Joe reached across the table and picked up the competition flyer. Full scholarship, he read aloud. Plus a debut recital. Sounds like a pretty big deal. He looked at her over his reading glasses. How much is the entry fee? Priya gestured to the pile of tips. About this much, a week's worth. That's also about what you need for Mom's medicine, she finished. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Uncle Joe stood up, his chair squeaking against the floor. He walked to the kitchen door, then turned back. You know what I see when you're working. Even on the busiest days, even when everything's chaos, you've got this rhythm to you, like you're hearing music nobody else can hear. Been watching you turn this diner into your concert hall for 3 years now. He paused. Maybe it's time to let other people hear that music too. After he left, Priya sat alone in the break room, staring at the tip money and the competition flyer. Her phone buzzed. A message from her mother. Had a good day at therapy. Doctor says I'm getting stronger. Don't worry so much about me, Beta. Sometimes you have to chase your own sunshine. Tears blurred her vision as she read the message again. Her mother always had a way of knowing, even from her hospital bed, exactly what was in Priya's heart. With trembling fingers, she picked up the jar of tip money. The pills could wait 1 more week. They had enough to get by until her next paycheck. But the competition deadline wouldn't wait. Standing up, she emptied the jar onto the table and began counting out the entry fee. Each bill felt like a promise. To her mother, to herself, to the music that had never really left her. Tomorrow morning, before her shift, she would go to the church. Father Thomas had mentioned that the piano tuner was coming. A sign, perhaps, that it was time to play for more than just the empty pews and stained glass windows. As she locked up the break room, her fingers tapped out the opening notes of the pieces she would play. No longer just habit, but preparation. The diner was dark except for the streetlights streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. In the quiet, she could almost hear the music she would play, echoing with all the dreams she'd tucked away but never quite forgotten. Word spread through the diner like spilled coffee. It started with Mrs. Kumar telling her bridge club over breakfast, then the college students overheard and shared it with their study group. By the end of the week, it seemed everyone knew. The quiet waitress who played piano during her breaks had entered a major music competition. Priya noticed the change gradually. First, it was the way people watched her hands as she poured coffee, as if trying to spot something special in the way her fingers held the pot. Then came the questions, hesitant at first, growing bolder with each passing day. "What pieces are you playing for the competition?" asked the businessman who always ordered eggs Benedict. He'd never said more than thank you before. "Is it true you studied at a conservatory?" wondered the young mother who came in with her toddler every Thursday. The attention made Priya's cheeks burn, but something else was happening too. Regular customers started adjusting their schedules around her practice times. They'd peek through the church's stained glass windows, listening to her play. Some even slipped notes of encouragement with their tips. "Good luck," and "We believe in you." One morning, she arrived at work to find Uncle Joe struggling with something in the storage room. "Give me a hand here," he called out. As Priya rounded the corner, she stopped short. There, covered in years of dust, but still magnificent, stood an upright piano. "Found it buried under old menus and boxes," Uncle Joe said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Been here since my father ran the place. He used to have live music on Sundays." He patted the wooden case. "Piano tuners coming this afternoon." But Priya's voice caught in her throat. "The competition's in 3 weeks. I can't practice during business hours." "Who said anything about business hours?" Uncle Joe tossed her a key. "Storage room's yours after closing. Better than sneaking across to the church in the dark." That evening, after the last customer left, Priya opened the piano's lid. The keys were yellowed with age, but when she pressed middle C, the note rang true. As she began to play, something magical happened. The diner's acoustics transformed her music, making it dance between the chrome and glass, turning the familiar space into something new. She was so absorbed in playing that she didn't notice the small crowd gathering outside the diner's windows. When she finally looked up, she saw her coworkers, who had stayed after their shifts, sitting quietly at the counter. Me, the new waitress, had tears in her eyes. "That was beautiful," Mai whispered. "I had no idea." The next day, a sign appeared in the diner's window. "Special evening practice sessions. Come hear our own pianist prepare for the city conservatory competition." Uncle Joe had written it in his messy handwriting, complete with coffee stains on the corners. "You can't charge people to listen." Priya protested when she saw it. "Who's charging?" he replied with a wink. "But if they happen to order coffee and pie while they listen." As the competition drew closer, the diner became more than just a place to eat. During her evening practices, people would sit for hours, nursing cold cups of coffee, letting the music wash over them. The elderly couple who shared toast every morning brought their grandchildren. The college students spread out their books but never turned a page, too caught up in the music. One evening, a well-dressed woman stayed until the very end of Priya's practice. "I'm from the local newspaper," she said, pulling out a notebook. "Would you mind telling me your story? We'd love to feature you in our community section." Priya's first instinct was to decline, but then she saw Uncle Joe nodding encouragingly from behind the counter. She thought about her mother, who always said that sharing your gifts was a way of thanking those who helped you develop them. "It's not just my story," Priya found herself saying. "It's about this place, these people." She gestured around the diner, at the worn booths that had held countless dreams, at the piano that had waited years to be found, at the faces of customers who had become family. That night, as she locked up, Priya realized something had shifted. The diner no longer felt like a detour on the way to her dreams. It had become part of them. The coffee-scented air, the squeaky floorboards, the clinking of dishes had become her accompaniment, turning her practice sessions into performances, her workplace into a concert hall. And as she played her final notes each evening, the applause that drifted in from the street reminded her that sometimes the best audiences are the ones you serve coffee to every morning. The morning of the competition dawned clear and bright. Priya stood in front of her small apartment mirror, hardly recognizing herself in the simple blue dress she'd bought from the thrift store. No apron, no name tag, no comfortable work shoes, just a woman about to play piano for the first time in front of a real audience in nearly a decade. Her phone buzzed with messages of support. The diner staff had created a group chat they called Piano Princess Support Squad, despite her protests about the silly name. Photos started pouring in. Uncle Joe arranging a clothes for special event sign on the diner's door. May decorating tables for the viewing party they'd planned for later, regular customers wishing her luck. The whole diner's cheering for you, Betta. Read a message from her mother, accompanied by a photo of her hospital room. Someone had brought her a tiny portable radio to listen to the competition broadcast. I'll be hearing every note. The competition hall loomed ahead as Priya climbed the stone steps, her sheet music clutched to her chest. Inside, other contestants warmed up in practice rooms, their music mixing in the hallways. Some wore expensive concert clothes and carried leather music cases. Priya thought of her borrowed dress and the sheet music she'd carefully ironed to remove the wrinkles from being stored so long. A volunteer led her to a practice room. 10 minutes until your slot, she said kindly. The small room held an upright piano similar to the one in the church. Priya sat down, letting her fingers rest on the keys without playing. In her mind, she could hear the familiar sounds of the diner. The coffee machine's hiss, the clinking plates, the morning chatter. Somehow, those sounds had become her warm-up music over the past weeks. Next performer, please. The call came too soon. Walking onto the stage, Priya felt the bright lights, saw the judge's table, heard the rustle of the audience. But instead of the paralyzing fear she'd expected, she felt something else. The weight of all those early mornings in the diner, all those practice sessions in the church, all those evenings playing for customers who'd become family. She spotted them in the audience. Uncle Joe had closed the diner for the morning so everyone could come. They sat together in the middle rows. Her coworkers still in their uniforms. They'd have to rush back for the lunch shift. Mrs. Kumar, with her ever-present shawl, the college students with their laptops closed for once. Even Father Thomas had come. They weren't just faces in the crowd. They were her story, sitting right there in the concert hall. The piano waited, its lid raised like a black wing. As Priya sat down, she remembered something her mother used to say. Music isn't about being perfect, it's about being true. She placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first piece was Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata. She'd chosen it for its story of struggle and triumph. As her fingers found their way through the familiar patterns, she thought about the past weeks. The early morning practices before the diner opened, the late nights in the storage room, the encouraging notes slipped under her tip jar. Each note carried a piece of that journey. Then came the second piece, Chopin's Nocturne, the one her mother had always loved. She played it the way she'd heard it in their old apartment, the way she'd practiced it in the quiet church, the way she'd performed it for her diner family. The music filled the hall, but in her heart, she was playing for every person who'd helped her reach this moment. When the final note faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then, from somewhere in the middle rows, someone started clapping. The applause spread like a wave, and when Priya stood to bow, she saw Uncle Joe wiping his eyes with his handkerchief, trying to pretend he wasn't crying. Backstage, her hands were shaking as she checked her phone. Messages poured in. Photos of her mother crying happy tears in her hospital room, videos of the diner crew hugging each other, Congratulations from customers who listened to the broadcast while having their morning coffee at other cafes. One message stood out, a photo of the tip jar from the diner, now overflowing with notes and coins. Someone had changed its label from Mom's Medicine to Our Pianist's Future. The sight brought fresh tears to her eyes. Whether she won or lost today, she'd already received something more valuable than any prize. The chance to be truly heard, not just as a waitress who played piano, but as a musician who had found her way back to her dreams through the most unexpected stage. A small diner where coffee cups clinked like tiny cymbals, and every day brought a new audience to serve. The results came in as the sun was setting. Prida sat in the competition hall, surrounded by her diner family, holding Uncle Joe's hand on one side and Mies on the other. When they announced second place, calling her name, the cheers from her section of the audience were so loud that the announcer had to pause before continuing. Second place means a partial scholarship, Uncle Joe whispered, squeezing her hand. But Priya barely heard him. She was looking at her phone, where her mother had sent a voice message filled with happy sobs and words in their mother tongue that meant more than any prize. The walk back to the diner felt like floating. Everyone talked at once, planning celebrations, sharing their favorite moments from her performance. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of coming spring, and Priya thought about how different everything felt from just a few weeks ago. They rounded the corner to find the diner glowing like a lighthouse. Through the windows, she could see dozens of people inside. Regular customers, neighbors, even some faces she recognized from her church practice sessions. Someone had hung a banner that read, "Congratulations to our star," in Uncle Joe's messy handwriting. "But don't we need to open for dinner service?" Priya asked, suddenly remembering it was a Friday night. Uncle Joe grinned. "Oh, we're open. Just with a slight change to the menu." Inside, the tables had been rearranged to create a small performance space around the old piano. The specials board now read, "Tonight only. Coffee, pie, and concert by our award-winning pianist. The partial scholarship covers most of the conservatory costs," Uncle Joe explained, "but we thought you might need help with the rest." He gestured to a jar on the counter, her old Mom's Medicine jar, now labeled Piano Fund, already half full of bills. Prida's vision blurred with tears. "I can't accept." "You're not accepting anything," Mrs. Kumar interrupted, appearing beside her. "We're investing in our favorite musician. Besides, where else can we get dinner and a concert for the price of coffee and pie?" The evening turned into something magical. Priya played while people ate, taking requests, sharing stories between pieces about her journey. The college students who'd spent countless hours studying in her section filmed everything for their social media. "Local waitress becomes piano star" was trending in their small town's corner of the internet. During a break, Mai brought her a plate of food. "Your mom's on video call," she said, holding up a tablet. "The hospital Wi-Fi is actually working tonight." Priya's mother's face filled the screen, tired but beaming. "I always knew you'd find your way back to music," she said softly. "Sometimes life takes us on detours so we can gather more people to share our journey." Looking around the diner, Priya understood what her mother meant. Every face held a piece of her story. The customers who'd listened to her practice, the coworkers who'd covered her shifts so she could prepare, Father Thomas, who'd first opened the church doors for her, Uncle Joe, who'd believed in her enough to dig out an old piano from storage. As the night went on, something remarkable happened. People began sharing their own dreams. The businessman confessed he'd always wanted to write poetry. The young mother spoke about her abandoned art classes. One of the college students revealed she'd been too scared to apply to medical school. "You know," Uncle Joe said, addressing the crowded diner, "we've got this piano now. Maybe we could make this a regular thing. Not just for Priya, but for anyone who needs a place to share their gifts." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic applause. Priya felt a warmth spread through her chest as she realized that her music had done more than just fulfill her own dreams. It had created a space where others could dare to dream too. Late that night, after the last customer left, Preya sat alone at the piano. The keys still held the warmth of an evening's worth of music. Outside, the street was quiet, but the diner felt alive with echoes of laughter, applause, and shared hopes. Her phone buzzed with a message from the conservatory. Classes would start in 3 weeks. But for now, her hands found their way to the keys, playing softly in the dimly lit diner. The melody was different this time, not a practice piece or competition selection, but something new, something that sounded like gratitude, like belonging, like coming home. She would still serve morning coffee and clear tables, but now she would also fill the diner with music. Her two worlds had merged into something better than she could have imagined. A place where dreams could grow alongside the everyday, where a simple waitress could become a pianist without stopping being herself. As she locked up for the night, her fingers drumming their familiar rhythm on the door handle, Freya smiled. Sometimes the best stage isn't the grandest concert hall, but the place where people know your name, share your journey, and believe in your dreams enough to make them their own.